I wanted to welcome you for coming to this lecture. Those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm the new dean of the law school, Gary Simpson. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Professor Melman, and then he will introduce Dr. Wood. This is Dr. Wood is the Schroeder Scholar in Residence, and she's speaking to us in that capacity. Let me talk a little about Professor Melman, and then he will introduce her. He's the director of the law school's Law and Medicine Center, which really historically has been a path-breaking center, founded more than 50 years ago and was the first law school center to study health law. Professor Melman took over as director in 1986 from the founding director, who was the former dean, Oliver Schroeder, for whom the endowment fund that's funding this lecture was named. Professor Melman has been the director since then. In the past couple of years, though, he has a co-director, Associate Dean Hoffman, and Professor Berg is an associate director. Professor Melman came to Case Western Reserve as a result of what has to be clearly and obviously successful nationwide search for a successor to Professor Schroeder. At the time, he was at Arnold & Porter, where he was specializing in health law. He went to Arnold & Porter right after graduating from Yale Law School, where he overlapped as a student with luminaries such as Bill and Hillary Clinton, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito, and also overlapped with lesser lights like me. His time at Yale was preceded by a couple of years at Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and he was there right after Reed College. He's the author in 2003 of a book, Wonder Genes, Genetic Enhancement and the Future of Society. He's co-author in 1998 of a book, Access to the Genome, The Challenge to Equality. He co-authored a casebook on genetics. He's written articles on a broad range of topics, and having read some of them myself, I can tell you that he writes in a way that's really accessible to people, not only experts in the field, and much to his credit, he's not afraid to be provocative in his writing. He's a recipient of a number of grants and honors, and let me turn it over to him now to introduce Dr. Wood.
Thank you, and welcome to this year's Schroeder Lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to mention a program that we have coming up on the 27th and 28th of October. You will be getting information about that. That is going to be a rather unique opportunity to engage in national health reform here in this room. We're going to have a small group of invited experts, and we're going to spend a little bit less than a day and a half trying to craft a system that would provide an alternative for those who do not have adequate health insurance under our current system. And I think this is going to be an exciting possibility. The audience will help, and so please, if you can make yourself free at that time, please join us. It will be open to the public. This is the Schroeder Lecture, as Dean Simpson said. It honors our founder, Oliver Schroeder. It is a lecture that is given, an award that is given to a person who has made a significant contribution in health law or health policy. Past recipients have included the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, the Secretary of HHS, academics, and luminaries, and none of them are more qualified than today's recipient of the Schroeder Honor to give us this talk. Professor Wood is now research professor at George Washington University School of Public Health and Health Services. She has been a tireless public servant since 1990, when she began her public career on Capitol Hill. She then went to the Department of Health and Human Services, and then finally to the Food and Drug Administration, where she served from 2000 to 2005 as the Assistant Commissioner for Women's Health. One of the phenomena that I became familiar with when I was in practice in Washington, D.C. was the government's revolving door, how people working in the government so often leave the government for lucrative jobs in the private sector. And indeed, Dr. Wood did go out of a revolving door, but as she said in an interview in 2005, when asked, "Do you know what you'll do next?" she answered, "No, I don't follow the advice I give to other people, which is to always line up a job before you give up a current one. I resigned without a parachute." Well, she did not, in fact, land on her feet. She landed on a pair of jet skis, and she has been traveling tirelessly around the country ever since, advocating for women's health issues and for the proper role of science in public policy. She has a Ph.D. in biology. She was a researcher at Johns Hopkins in neuroscience before she went into the private sector. I'd like you to welcome her today. Her topic is the role of science in health policy decision-making, the case of emergency contraception.
Thank you, Professor Melvin and Dean Simpson, and thanks to Case Western Reserve for inviting me to provide this lecture and to be the Schroeder Scholar today and to give this lecture. It's a real privilege and an honor, and contrary to Mark, being here with those who have spoken before is rather humbling, and I'll try and live up to that, but you can be the judge of that. It's also sort of humbling to try and speak in front of a group of law students and law professors knowledgeable in legal and in policy issues far more than I am. I sort of lived and learned by doing in terms of how to create health policy and be involved in health policy at the Food and Drug Administration, coming at it from this perspective of a scientist and a biologist who then, through a rather zigzag career, immersed myself in public policy, health policy, specifically around women's health. But I think the connection is to areas much more broad than that in terms of health across the spectrum, and then also other areas of public policy that depend on good science and good decision-making that's based on that science. So today I'll talk about the case of emergency contraception. That's sort of the most legalistic way I can think of calling it. But it's in part a story about how FDA works. It's part of a story about how science is used in this type of decision normally, and then a story of what happens when science is in fact ignored. Things have been changing over the last few months, so we'll try and keep everyone up to date as to what the status is on this particular case. But I think the issues of how an agency like the FDA, which we count on for so much, needs to make its decisions, and how it has been making decisions in recent years, gives us pause, gives me pause as a scientist. I hope it gives you pause as legal experts and scholars, and it certainly should give the public pause when they count on, which includes all of us, when they count on FDA for good decision making. So we'll just go ahead and get started with that then. Now, I was Assistant Commissioner for Women's Health, and I want to talk about the fact that women's health is not just reproductive health. And so my position within FDA was a role to ensure the appropriate focus on women's health across the FDA. And when I talk about women's health, this is a definition by the Public Health Service that was actually created some years ago, but serves as sort of the basis for what we mean by women's health. And so, sure, it is those things. Those things that are unique to women, so pregnancy, ovarian cancer, conditions like that, things that are more prevalent in women, so things like lupus, other autoimmune disorders, things that might be more serious in women, so that could be things, the consequences of sexually transmitted diseases, and for which the risk factors might be different in women, and that could be HIV/AIDS or heart disease, or where the intervention or care might be different, and that would include all of the above. Because as we learn more about some of these distinctions, We learn when they exist and when they don't exist, where there are differences and where there are similarities, and that data helps then drive appropriate intervention and care. And so that's sort of what we meant by women's health and still mean by women's health. And it includes reproductive health, but it is not limited to reproductive health. And again, so this sort of gives an idea of the range of issues that we mean by women's health, from mental health to inclusion of women in clinical trials, analysis of sex and gender differences, menopause, heart disease, and so forth. It's not a limited view. But unfortunately, it was on something around reproductive health, even though that's not something I spent a whole lot of time on. That was what led to my resignation in August of 2005, and no one was more surprised than I was. But this is, what the vision of women's health in terms of the research that needs to be done, the knowledge that needs to be gained, and the application of that knowledge in the development of drugs and devices and so forth that are regulated by the FDA. Now, what FDA does, and in this case, we're talking about an intersection between law, science, and other factors. And FDA was created under statute, and I'll talk a minute about that, but it depends on the data that is generated under certain required studies and evaluation by both internal and external experts, and is driven towards the mission of promoting the public health by applying this knowledge in the constraints, the legal and regulatory constraints that surround it. Now, I want to bring you up to date on the latest decision on Plan B, then we'll drop back and figure out how we got there. Just a few weeks ago, FDA announced that we are indeed going to allow Plan B emergency contraception as an over-the-counter drug. That is not require a prescription. It will be limited to those 18 and older. Women under the age of 18 will still require a prescription. Because of that status, it will be available only through pharmacies and health clinics. And the company has some other requirements in terms of marketing requirements and so forth. This was a dramatic change from where it was a year ago. It is not still a fully correct decision in my view, but it is a movement in the right direction. And again, so how did we get to this, and what does it really mean that we've now gotten to this sort of partial approval? Now I'm going to have to go back, and for those of you who are experts in FDA law, this will be very basic. For those of you who are not, I hope it's educational. FDA has a very broad mandate to ensure that products are safe and effective, that they are accurately represented in labeling and any information that comes out about a product, and that they comply with the numerous laws and regulations that exist around FDA. And FDA is not just drugs. Food and Drug Administration gives you a clue as to one of the other major things that it regulates. But it does regulate drugs in terms of both brand name drugs and generic drugs, in terms of prescription and non-prescription drugs. It's not just approving new drugs, but monitoring their safety after approval. It's also inspecting the manufacturing plants to assure quality control of production, both in the United States and around the world. It's also responsible for biologics, which includes the vaccine supply, as well as the human blood supply in terms of safety. Animal drugs as well. Medical devices and radiologic health, that includes medical devices such as might be implanted in your hip or in your heart. It's also products such as breast implants. It's also any device that might be used in surgery, medical equipment, x-ray equipment, all mammography facilities, things that emit radiation like x-ray and mammography. It's also things like computer terminals and television screens and microwave ovens in terms of the radiation emission. The FDA has this huge mandate around all of these products. We did add on the food supply to ensure the safety of the food supply. So all of that you're reading about the spinach. And E. coli at the moment is under FDA jurisdiction, and they're busily trying to sort that one out. They regulate all food except meat and poultry, both fresh food, seafood, processed food, to ensure that the plants that are manufactured, the transportation and storage is maintained to standards to ensure safety from contamination, from things that may come across international borders, but also by terrorism now that has been added to the list of things to work on and be responsible for. So there's this huge, very broad and very deep mandate for FDA, responsibility for FDA, and most people, unless you're involved in FDA law, should not, or science, should not have to really pay attention to that. Each one of these product groups has its own center within FDA. It has its own statutory authority, which differs one from another. Drugs and biologics probably have the most stringent requirements on demonstrating safety and efficacy of products. Less so for medical devices, less so for foods, and less even so for cosmetics and dietary supplements. And each one of these has their own statutory structure and infrastructure and regulations that flow from them. So what I'm going to talk about has to do with a particular drug product, but because the action and the issues that were identified have to do with decisions made at the highest level of FDA, to whom all of these centers report, it reflects upon issues that are important across the agency. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Plan B emergency contraception to make sure we're all on board as to what this is about. Because I think many people rightfully think that this is a very controversial subject, and because of its controversy, it's perhaps unique and therefore more understandable in terms of how it was handled differently from other products. But in fact, I would argue that this is actually not a controversial subject. For the vast majority of the people of the United States, it's not a controversial subject with regard to the science and medical evidence. And it's really not a controversial subject with regard to how it should be handled within FDA. So what is emergency contraception? It is, in fact, just high-dose birth control pills. It's the same hormone that's found in many birth control pills, progestin. The progestin-only birth control pill contains no estrogen. It acts the same way as regular birth control pills do, using the same biologic mechanisms. It's a method that's been around since the 60s, when physicians and nurses and student health clinics knew that if emergency contraception was needed, just take 2 or 4 or 6 of your birth control pill pack and do that again in 12 hours, and you would reduce the likelihood of pregnancy after unprotected sex. However, it came as a special product. Before it was unapproved use, off-label use of an approved product was how it was used in this country and around the world during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the first part of the 90s. But in the middle 90s, the FDA put out a notice in the Federal Register asking companies to come in if they were interested in putting forward a product that would be an approved use, seek approval for this off-label use, because it was so widespread and it had a lot of studies and evidence available for it, and therefore companies should know that FDA was interested in looking at applications for these types of products. 2 products came in. One was an estrogen-progestin combination product called Proven. That product is now largely off the market because the company has just withdrawn it, because a progestin-only product, which has fewer side effects in terms of immediate side effects, came on the market in 1999, and that was Plan B. It was the manufacturer then in 2003 sought over-the-counter status, sought to change it from prescription to non-prescription status, and that's a sort of routine application when you're seeking a change, a labeling change and a status change through the FDA. It's very important to point out that this product does not cause abortion. And its only connection to abortion is that it can prevent the need for one. This is why this is actually not controversial and should be common ground. It's very, very safe. There is no disagreement in the medical and scientific community about the risk. This has a very good safety profile. There are very limited risks associated with it, and it's a very safe product in comparison with other over-the-counter products already on the market. It is quite safe, and there's a very strong consensus about that. An important factor is that this needs to be taken very soon, within hours, in order to be effective. It is labeled by the FDA for use up to 72 hours after unprotected sex. The World Health Organization indicates that it could be taken up to 5 days after unprotected sex. However, I think everyone agrees that it loses efficacy over time. So it may have some minimal effectiveness at 5 days out, but really, if you really want to reduce chances of unintended pregnancy, sooner is better. 12 hours is better than 24 hours, 24 hours is better than 48 hours, and so on. Sooner is better. Thus, the need for ready access and barriers that take time actually reduce the effectiveness of this particular product. And it's important that this provides a woman a second chance to prevent an unintended pregnancy. Whether it, for whatever reason, a broken condom, missed pills, a rape, or just the case of unprotected sex, this is a second chance to actually prevent unintended pregnancy. This is not RU486. It does not cause an early abortion. It, in fact, acts the same way regular birth control pills and therefore, if you're comfortable with birth control pills as a method of contraception, you can be equally comfortable with this. And similarly, those who object to emergency contraception, for whatever their rationale happens to be consistent, one has to also object to all oral contraceptive methods and to the IUD. So this is squarely in the family of regular contraception that and needs to be considered that way, not something different than regular birth control pills in terms of its mechanism of action. Right, so now we're all speed on that. Now we get to go over FDA 101. And again, my apologies to those who are probably more expert in this than I am. When FDA receives an application, it comes in from the company. The company has to initiate its application for a change. This is not something FDA can do or usually does in terms of changing a status without an application. The application comes in, and in this case it would have gone to the Center for Drugs, and it will then be referred to the appropriate review divisions. In this case, these are teams of scientists and physicians who are looking at the chemistry, the physiology, the pharmacology, looking at the clinical aspects, looking at the manufacturing, if it's a new product, and so forth. So we have two divisions, actually, who are looking at an application to go over the counter. One, it goes to the division that reviews all over-the-counter drug products, the OTC group. It then goes to the sort of the home division for this type of product, so it goes to the reproductive health and urologic drug products review team. And so these two divisions received the application for a product to go over the counter. They then begin the evaluation of the data that's submitted to them. FDA has the option, and it is optional, to convene its outside advisory committee. Now, each of the review divisions, for all the different areas in drugs and devices and so forth, has a standing advisory committee made up of outside experts. They can bring in additional experts for any particular advisory committee, but that advisory committee is convened at the call of the FDA, and it addresses questions that are posed by the FDA. They have presentations by the manufacturer, presentations by FDA staff, public comment, and then discuss and vote on particular questions that are posed by the agency to the outside advisory committee. If such an advisory committee is called, and after that, the reviews would be completed and recommendations would be generated by the reviewers. It then goes up a review chain through the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, that's CEDAR. It goes through a chain of review from the review teams up the hierarchy until a final decision is reached and delivered. FDA did convene an joint advisory committee between the OTC group and the Reproductive Health Advisory Group, and convened a meeting in December to look at this, and then this sort of chain occurred. Now, there are a number of different places where decisions can change at FDA. The FDA does not have to take the advice of its advisory committee, and that's a prerogative held dear by the agency. There are identifiable cases where the FDA did not accept the recommendations of the advisory committee in terms of approval or disapproval. Sometimes it's because they had information that the advisory committee did not have. Sometimes it's because the advisory committee is making recommendations that went beyond the scope of the legal authority or regulatory authority of the agency. Sometimes it was just because there's a disagreement in the interpretation of the data, and they came to different conclusions. So overruling the advisory committee is not something that, for folks inside FDA, gives people inside FDA particular heartburn. It looks unusual from the outside, but it's not something that is inherently, by its nature, a problem. But it becomes a bit more of a problem. That not accepting recommendations usually happens at the reviewer level. The team of scientists and clinicians who know the data best have poured through the usually thousands of pages of data and studies that have come in, and that's where if there's going to be a disagreement, that's normally where it takes place. Now, after the review level, the reviewers then make their recommendations up the two divisions to their division directors to approve, disapprove. Maybe there needs to be further safety studies done. Maybe there's questions about the quality of the data, or maybe there's complete agreement. In any case, they report up to the division directors. Each division director reports to an office director, and there are about 6 or 7 office directors in the Center for Drug and their attendant divisions. And then the office directors all report to the Office of New Drugs, who reports to the center director. And it's usually, if there's agreement, the decisions are made, the recommendations go up, and if there's agreement at the division, reviewer level, division level, and office director level, in this case we have 2 groups working on it, so we need the 2 office directors to agree with each other. If that's the case, if there's agreement, then that's normally where a decision is issued. It stops mid-level in FDA, the Center for Drugs, to issue a decision if there's agreement. If there's disagreement and something has to be sorted out, it's sorted out throughout the hierarchy until there's agreement. Occasionally it might go up to the Office of New Drugs. Quite rarely it would go up to the Center Director. It's quite extraordinary to get into the Commissioner's office because usually the disagreements have been sorted out one way or another before that. But those are sort of the hierarchy and the points of change that can occur within the Center for Drugs. So what happened with Plan B? Okay. So, as I mentioned, the company came in with an application in summer of 2003 to bring it over the counter. The type of data you have to bring in for this type of application is not safety and efficacy data. That's the data that's been brought in for a new drug application to get it approved as a prescription drug. The type of data you have to bring in for this type of application is primarily is label comprehension data and actual use data. So you have to show that the label is understandable and that people can use the product according to the label without the help of a learned intermediary, without the help of a doctor, a nurse practitioner, or other prescriber, or a pharmacist. That's the type of data you have to show. And that's the data that the company came in with. And in December of 2003, there was an advisory committee where this data was presented by the company. The data was also reanalyzed and presented by the FDA professional staff. It had the support going over the counter from the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American College of OBGYNs. It also had strong public support, although there was, a rather lively public comment session. But it was clear from the data and from the process as it went that far that this was a very strong application. The data was quite clear, and it had a real possibility of public health benefit by being able to provide a method for women to help prevent unintended pregnancy. All to the good. Everyone was quite optimistic at that point, except after that advisory committee, we began to hear a couple of different things sort of inside the FDA. We began to hear that the answer was going to be no, and it was going to be about teens. We began to hear that the decision was not going to be made at the office director level, but would be made at a higher level inside the FDA. So the reviewers heard all this actually before they had completed their reviews. This was rather disturbing. And they provided more data to answer questions that were being posed from above. So they wrote up their reviews, and they all recommended approved. Not approvable, which is the next first step, but approved for all females with childbearing potential. Both divisions recommended approved. The division directors concurred and recommended approved. The office directors concurred, recommended approved. If they were then told no, we normally would issue a decision, but this will not happen this time. It went up to the head of the Office of New Drugs. He concurred quite strongly and recommended approved. And then it went up. He was not allowed to issue that decision. And then it went up to the next level in May of 2004 when the senator, boy, that's some sort of Freudian slip. The senator director sent a non-approvable letter. Now, non-approvable is significantly different from approved. It could have been an approvable, would have been the next level saying we're going to approve it, but you have to work something out. He actually went from a full-blown approval recommendation to non-approvable and said that the company, that it was indeed about teens, and that the company would have to submit further data on young teens in terms of their actual use and label comprehension studies, or they should come back in with a new application, keeping it prescription status for those under the age of 16 and non-prescription for those 16 and older. Now, some of the arguments here were the public debate, and the public debate was around the concern that access to emergency contraception would promote risky sexual behavior, particularly among young teens. And that's a reasonably valid question. I understand the kind of worry that evokes in parents, but nonetheless, there's actually data to address that question. There have been studies done in the United States and in the United Kingdom looking at behavior change when there is ready access to emergency contraception. And as many of you probably know, it's very difficult to change people's behavior, and particularly sexual behavior, and access to one more form of over-the-counter contraception doesn't change anybody's behavior in terms of their regular contraceptive use, in terms of risky sexual behavior. The only behavior changed somewhat, and not as much as we'd like, is that if a woman needed emergency contraception, she is more likely to reach for it and use it if it's readily available. She's not likely to need it more often, but when she needs it, she might actually use it, which would be a good thing. That's what the data told us. That data was presented. But that's not the technical or legal or regulatory issue that was facing the agency at that time, because that was not really technically what you're supposed to show in an over-the-counter application. You have to show actual use and label comprehension. Can you read the label and use it correctly based on the label? That's the studies you have to present in order to demonstrate an appropriate movement to over-the-counter status. And the letter from the center director said that the issue was there were not enough very young teens under age 16 in the label comprehension and actual use studies that had been presented. And it's true, there were not many. There were some, but not many. Not enough to do a separate subpopulation analysis on that group of under 16s. It was a representative population of users, but it was not a large enough sample to do a statistical analysis. And so you say, well, that seems a reasonable question. Maybe we should know if young teens particularly can read the label and understand it and use it correctly. Now, it is a very simple label. It has about 2 or 3 steps. Take one now, take one in 12 hours. It's very simple. But, okay. That could be a fair question, except that FDA has never asked that question of any other over-the-counter medicine, ever. We don't ask if young teens can read the labels about pain medication, which they might be taking for menstrual cramps and migraines and might overdose on. We don't ask that question about cough medicine or cold medicine that's over-the-counter. Can young teens understand that and use the label correctly? We've never asked that. On the flip side, we have never asked, FDA has never asked, can people over the age of 80 understand, read and understand and use the product correctly for any over-the-counter medication in combination with, however many other medications they might be taking. We don't ask for subpopulation analysis on different groups of those who might use the product based on a particular concern. Now, maybe we should, but we never have. But on this product at this time, FDA insisted and denied this product based on something that it was, sort of unprecedented. And you have to remember that this is a very safe product. As I point out up here, it was a unanimous vote by the advisory committee that it was safe in an over-the-counter setting. And so there really is no question that even if they read it wrong and used it incorrectly, there's not a safety issue here. And that's, I think, critical when looking at, each drug is different and so forth. There really is no safety concern. So in May of 2004, this decision was announced over the objections of everyone inside the professional staff at FDA, below the center director. I'm not part of this review chain. I was part of the commissioner's office. But I disagreed with this decision, but I did not resign. And because I think the center director did believe at that time that if this was done, for whatever reason that he did this, whatever reason he felt the need to do this, that if he did this, in 6 months' time, he would be able to approve it. And that a partial approval was better than no approval. And that for some reason he would not be allowed to approve it in total, but he could get away with this limited approval. And so he made this decision to overturn the science and overturn all the recommendations and send a non-approvable letter and ask for a different status, but laying out a path forward. So we all just went quiet and didn't answer many questions and hoped that the next round would be smoother. So the company came back in that summer with an application asking, just as FDA had suggested in the letter, that the product only be approved over the counter for those 16 and older. 6 months go by, that's normal FDA timeline for reaching a decision in a product like this. And it's now January of 2005. Now, I happen to be out of the country at this time. I was on a fellowship working with the FDA equivalent over in London, having a great time. But I was staying in touch with FDA, my colleagues back in the Office of Women's Health, but also various and sundry people in different parts of the agency on different issues that I was working on. And I know quite conclusively that in January of 2005, the Center for Drugs had agreed that it would approve Plan B emergency contraception over the counter. Now, at this point, there had been a slight shift. Now it was going to be 17 and older. Now, this was sort of, again, a sort of technical rationale based on the nature of the data that had been submitted. But it was also a rationale thinking we need to make sure we dot all our I's and cross all our T's in order to get this out. But we've now reached a conclusion. It is going to be approved. It's going to be approved for 17 and older, and it's going to happen in a matter of days. It's going to be a straight approval letter. Not an approvable. It will be a straight approval letter. It will go out within days, maybe a week tops. Oh, great. We will take it. We will take it. It's a compromise. It's ignoring young teens, and there's no rationale but we'll take this for now. And then months go by, and the letter is not issued, the approval is not announced. And inside FDA, we live behind a wall from which you cannot talk outside. So it's not unusual that people outside didn't know what was going on. What was extraordinary was no one inside knew what was going on. And this is a rather disturbing aspect of the whole story. So during this period, all sorts of things began to happen outside of the agency. Months went by with no decision being announced. And at that time, Dr. McClellan, former Schroeder scholar, had left the agency just before the May of 2004 decision. He moved over to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and he was replaced with an acting commissioner, Dr. Crawford. Dr. Crawford was still acting commissioner by the next spring and had been nominated to be permanent commissioner. However, Senators Murray of Washington State and Senator Clinton of New York put a hold on his nomination before his Senate confirmation, saying that there must be a decision. Not what the decision should be, but that FDA had missed its statutory deadlines and therefore needed to issue a decision before they would confirm Dr. Crawford as permanent commissioner of the FDA. This went on for several more months until a promise came from Dr. Crawford and from Secretary Leavitt, Secretary of Health and Human Services. They promised that by September 1st, FDA would take an action on the Plan B application. And so Dr. Crawford was confirmed. I returned from the UK and catching up on a whole host of things, but also asked what was going on with Plan B. And I asked at multiple levels, at the reviewer level, division level, office director level, all up and down the chain into the highest levels of the commissioner's office to the professional staff. And the answer was both surprising and disturbing, and also quite consistent. Throughout the agency, within the review chain and into the commissioner's office, the answer was, we don't know. We have no idea. No one's asked us for any more data. No one's asked us any more questions. No one's asked us for any more memos. No one's told us what the decision is. No one's told us what's going to happen. We have no idea. And that was at every level inside the agency. When I got to the highest points in the commissioner's office, people who've been at the agency for years and who are extremely influential told me, and I believe quite honestly, that they didn't know what the answer was, but they were waiting on the answer. This is now mid-August, and we're waiting on the answer. Now, we're not waiting on it from the FDA review process. That decision had been made before January. It was ready to go and let it be signed in early January. And here we are in August, and we are waiting on the answer, and we don't know what the answer is. And this was quite disturbing to me. Not that I didn't know the answer. That's okay. I mean, but the fact that the people who knew the data, who had been involved in the review process for the last, at that point, 2 years, did not know the answer. So here we are on August 26th. Ironically, Women's Equality Day is the anniversary of the day that women got the right to vote. It was a Friday afternoon, and Dr. Crawford held a press conference alone, without anyone from the Center for Drugs there, and announced that yes, indeed, the Center for Drugs is prepared to approve it for those 17 and older. However, we need to open this for public comment and possible rulemaking on the issue of the two-tier status of keeping a prescription for young teens and non-prescription for older teens and adults. Now, this is what FDA had asked for nearly a year and a half earlier. And yet, now we've decided we have to go into rulemaking. Being in an audience of law students and law professors and legal scholars, I assume you know how painful and long a process is of federal rulemaking. It takes years on a good day, and never if they don't really want it to come out. And if you're involved in federal rulemaking, you want to be doing it for a very good reason. That there's a reason for developing a regulation, that you're doing it for a higher purpose, and that you're going to have a concrete step forward when that rule is completed. But there's no rationale for this rulemaking. The argument was that this was such a novel and complex issue that had been proposed to keep a prescription status for one group and non-prescription status for another was so novel and complex that we needed a regulation on how to implement that situation. And so we were going to start the process of rulemaking. Now we have to remember that the decision at this time was a very simple one. The question was, do we allow access to a safe and effective contraception for women, essentially adults, 17 and older? Are we going to allow that to happen? And there was something so worrisome about that concept that it could not be allowed out. We've already cut out the young teens inappropriately, but we've cut them out of the equation. Now we're left only with essentially adult women with a safe and effective contraception that can prevent unintended pregnancy, prevent the need for abortion. And why is that so frightening? And I think when I heard this decision on that day, August 26th, and I realized it wasn't just me who'd been left out of the loop, but I knew that the senior-most people in the Center for Drugs they weren't aware of this decision until right before it was announced, or did not recommend the need for rulemaking. There was no need for this process. That I knew no matter what evidence came forward, no matter what rationale came forward, that this product was not going to be allowed out. And as head of women's health, I'm supposed to be able to, part of my job, to explain what's happening with FDA, in particular women's health issues, whether it's menopause or inclusion of women in clinical trials or diabetes and the products available for diabetes. This was not explainable. There is no rationale, there is no justification, either on a process basis or a scientific basis or a medical basis, that justifies this in any way. They were putting it into a bureaucratic black hole where it would disappear. And in their mind, it was a very strategic decision on their part. So I resigned. And it was in part, it was this issue of both scientific and personal credibility, and was not necessarily to sort of make a particular stand or a particular statement. But I was extraordinarily distressed by this decision because it was, after years of working on the inside in a very collaborative and collegial way, it became clear that on this particular issue, it didn't matter what rational discussion you brought to it, you were not going to succeed. So I resigned at that point, and an enormous amount of attention was generated. That attention, I think, led to ultimately why we have change today. Not that my resignation caused some change, but the fact that people became aware and energized and outraged at what was going on at FDA and began to ask the question whether they were folks involved in law and policy, or involved in reproductive health, or women's health, or public health, or the research community, or the clinical community, began to say, what is happening at FDA? This is a clear and obvious overturning of good science and good medical evidence for no good reason, and this cannot be allowed to stand. And so I think the energy that came from around the country was what ultimately led to the at least partial success we had earlier this year. I mean, I think that when we're talking about decision-making for health policy, we want it to be based on the best scientific and medical evidence, recognizing there are limitations to what we know, but we have to make judgments. And they often must promote the health of both individuals and the public health. And unfortunately, this decision did neither. And it left things in a rather dark and hopeless place at that time in terms of this particular issue, but also in terms of what was happening at FDA, in terms of the morale, in terms of the feeling amongst people, not in that particular review chain, but throughout the agency, in terms of were they valued as scientists valued as people who were doing their jobs, committed to the public health mission of the FDA. Was science going to be overturned in such a clear and obvious way in other cases? There are some serious issues here. Meanwhile, there's a lawsuit that's been pending, Tamino versus Crawford, and now it's Tamino versus von Eschenbach, because, I forgot to say, about a month after I resigned, Dr. Crawford resigned, after the amazing amount of energy and effort it took to get him confirmed. He resigned about 2 months into the job as permanent commissioner. And I have no idea why that occurred, but it led then to a new acting commissioner, Dr. von Eschenbach. Dr. von Eschenbach came over from the National Cancer Institute, and he became acting commissioner early on, not long after I resigned. And it was a real opportunity for him to say that we're going to go back to doing things based on the evidence, and I'll take a fresh look at it, and with my evaluation, it looks to me that we should let the Center for Drugs make its decision in a more routine fashion, and I don't need to be involved. Unfortunately, he did not say that. He continued to say for 11 months that that this was such a novel and complex issue that having a dual status, that we needed to go through this public comment period, and we now had all these thousands and tens of thousands of comments that needed to be evaluated, and it was still a very complex issue that needed to be sorted out. So he basically took the same position as his predecessor until he didn't in July. But meanwhile, in January of 2005, after the delay, and you're having that second round of delay, the Center for Reproductive Rights filed a lawsuit against FDA on behalf of organizations and individuals, basing it on the Administrative Procedures Act and constitutional grounds of right to privacy and sex discrimination. They're seeking to force approval for Plan B over the counter for all females of reproductive potential, not limited by age. And during the course of this, they were given the ability to depose government officials, and they have deposed Dr. McClellan and Dr. Crawford, the head of the Office of New Drugs, the head of the Center for Drugs, a number of the reviewers and office directors involved in the decision. And that served a very valuable purpose of getting us at least some more information about what happened, although we don't have any direct information about what happened at the commission's level and above, because they're not talking much about it. But it has been an opportunity to learn more. And this case still continues, even though what happened to the SAF's office with this partial approval. How the impact of this legal case will play, I don't know. And I've learned a lot as it's gone along, and I continue to try and understand, because my position upon my resignation was that I didn't know if it was illegal what the commissioner had done. He does have the delegated authority. He has the authority to pull up decisions to his level rather than delegating it down the chain. But I certainly did know that the process was not usual, and that the process ignored both the evidence and ignored the normal way of reaching decisions, in effect placed when there was actually no controversy over the data itself. In November of 2005, after I resigned and while I was in the middle of rulemaking, the GAO issued a report talking about the first decision, the May of 2004 decision. So the first decision was cut out with young teens. They had been asked to do an investigation of that first decision and came to the conclusion, which is sort of summarized in this title, that the decision process to deny the initial application for over-the-counter marketing of the emergency contraceptive drug Plan B was unusual. And it was very unusual. But the decision that was after that, the 2005 decision to put it into rulemaking, was even more extraordinary and even more unusual and more outrageous. There's documentation now between both the lawsuit and the GAO investigation that documents these actions and how extraordinary the decision process was. So now We're at July 31st, 2006, so another year goes by, or 11 months go by, and all of a sudden Dr. von Eschenbach announces that there's no need for rulemaking. Now, coincidentally, this is the day before his confirmation hearing in the Senate, and once again, Senators Murray and Senator Clinton had announced that they were putting a hold on his confirmation, and there was no way this hold was going to be lifted, and they did have the votes to keep this nomination from being voted on the floor of the Senate until the issue of Plan B was resolved one way or the other. That hiding behind rulemaking was not acceptable, that no one believed that this, in fact, was a legitimate use of rulemaking. In fact, it was an abuse of the rulemaking process. So he did announce that there's no need for rulemaking, and that there was this new way to get possible approval for women 18 and older. Now, notice the age has shifted once again. It's now up to age 18. Now, he does not argue that there's any scientific rationale for changing it from conception to 18. This is merely to improve convenience of implementation in pharmacy. There's no real reason for doing that either, but nonetheless, he's put his own mark on this decision, his own input, and raised the age to 18. So he announced that was possible, and that he would like to meet with the with Barr Pharmaceuticals, the company that owns Plan B, within the next week, and then the process would start up again. And what was extraordinary was that within about 3.5 weeks, this process is complete. A process that's taken 3 years is now done in 3 weeks. The company met with them. They submitted a supplement application which only changed the age. They had already said they would only market to pharmacies. They had already said that they would carry out education and monitoring programs. They had already agreed and offered to do all of that in many earlier applications. And the only thing they did was shift it up to age 18. And lo and behold, within about 3 weeks, it is in fact approved over the counter for those 18 and older. And again, no one was more surprised than I was. But I give a lot of credit again to the voices of the public and the scientific community and those who care about FDA functioning as a strong scientific organization for keeping it visible that FDA had strayed quite clearly off the path of good science and good decision making. I put this up here. This was a cartoon that came out right after the intelligent design case in Pennsylvania and published by Pittsburgh. And I put it up there, and I have to be very clear that I'm not criticizing those folks who work for FDA. I'm worried about the future of FDA. I'm worried about people looking and saying, is this a good career option for me? Is this somewhere I want to go and work as a scientist or anyone, a regulator, given this type of morale problem that this has generated within the agency? As I mentioned earlier, Dr. von Eschenbach is now nominated, and we now think his nomination will move forward. The hold has been lifted. But there's no evidence to continue this age restriction, and we still have FDA as a gold standard at risk. We still have damaged its reputation through this type of action, and it's not just this drug, but we now know it can happen anywhere across the agency if there's a small group of people with that much influence. There's places to get more information. You can also get information from the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is crlp.org with regard to the lawsuit. And these are other places where both scientists and the public can get information on what the status is of emergency contraception. I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much.
Let's take a few minutes for questions, following which there will be reception upstairs, so it's your choice. Questions.
some group in political power sees a harm associated with a drug that really doesn't involve safety and efficacy, and that really is probably not amenable to scientific study, at least in the short term. It's just sort of remarkable to me that that situation hasn't come up before. It hasn't, I'm not aware of it. But you said there were no similar cases.
Well, not in exactly the same kind of way. I mean, I think, public input and public, what FDA does should be transparent. Input with, surely there are many advocacy groups who have sent citizens petitions, letters, members of Congress who raise particular issues, and that input does come into FDA all the time, and it's perfectly appropriate for that type of input, whether it's from the White House or from Congress or from people in advocacy communities who say, we want this or we don't want that, and here's why. That input is certainly a legitimate and valid way of communicating to FDA, and it's happened in a lot of different cases. But then FDA should have the ability to say, we have, what is it within our mandate that we are supposed to use? And if what you brought to me are legitimate concerns about things within our bailiwick, we will take those on board and we will look at that. But if you bring to us issues that are not part of FDA's mandate, we appreciate the input, but that's not part of the sort of package that we are looking at as reviewers or as decision makers. And it requires, I think, a leadership that says, yes, I understand, the pressures that are coming in, but I will maintain an agency that, on the whole, and there are certainly many criticisms of whether about industry influence and as well as political, non-industry type influence, having an effect on decisions. But it's rare, or if ever, that something has been so clearly just sort of come in from out of the blue. Usually, if a debate is engendered, it's because there is some kind of question about the safety of a product or the quality of the manufactured product or the quality of the data that's been submitted. And maybe they'll, as in one strategy, which is to create a doubt in the quality of the data. Oh, well, there's other people who disagree with you, and here's their studies, even though they may not be of equal caliber. Or they try to at least place it in the framework of how FDA normally makes its decisions and muddy the waters there. What happened in this case was there's really no argument in terms of the science or the medical evidence in terms of safety or efficacy or appropriateness for over-the-counter. There's no counter data. There's no. It's a very small group of people who actually object to all contraception, even though they don't usually tell you that. If you press, you will determine that that is the case. Who have an agenda that is not at all a mainstream agenda that objects to, say a question of, genetic enhancement, as an example, where the science, they say, oh, this is a great way to go, but there may be public health or public policy decisions which need to weigh in on how that is managed. This was not that case. This is neither a case where the mainstream has concerns about contraception, because the vast majority of people use contraception at one point of their life or another. And also it promotes a public good of reducing unintended pregnancy and reducing the need for abortion. So there's really no larger public issue that needs to be incorporated around this particular medical or scientific question. And there is no debate in science. So it's a very unusual case in that way. So other things happen perhaps in other ways, but this sort of stood out and tells us that at least under these circumstances, where we are today, the FDA we have today, you don't have to even struggle with coming up with other data or other rationales. You can just turn it on its head, both in terms of process and the data.
I have heard that FDA does not require pharmaceutical companies to give negative results, and that only recently have they been asked to provide that there were prior testing, but not the results itself. Is that true?
I'm sorry, in what area?
Drugs.
And negative results of what kind, like negative outcomes? Like safety signals?
Anything like that, and negative results of the research.
You may be talking about negative studies, which they don't have to publish their results. And if companies do not have to publish their results, and FDA, when they receive information from a company and when they turn a company down for a product, they do not have to. Say a company comes in and says, we have a product already on the market and we'd like a new indication for it, for a different treatment. And the FDA turns it down for the lack of data or the safety problem, or no, you can't use it that way. FDA is constrained by law in releasing any of that information to the public because it's commercial confidential information. And there are efforts now to change the law around that. There are also, but safety signals for products that are on the market are required by law to be reported to the FDA and are generally made public in terms of safety signals, although it's not necessarily crystal clear on how you find that on their website. But it is, safety problems are reported, mandated to be reported to the agency by the companies. It's voluntary from physicians and individuals to report safety problems that they may experience a particular problem, but a company is required. But the negative studies that when they do a study that shows my product isn't as good as somebody else's product and they don't want to publish it, they don't have to.
So how is there anything scientific here if the scientists aren't told about that?
Well, the FDA will get a lot of the data. Now, after a product is on the market, the companies are supposed to provide any updated data that they may have to the FDA, and the FDA will consider it in whatever they may think about labeling. But again, the data that's submitted to the FDA right now is evaluated by scientists and physicians at the FDA, and there are issues of resource limitations around that, but they cannot release it publicly. And there's a lot of discussion, particularly in the areas of safety, of either requiring studies that are done to publish the results on the clinicaltrials.gov to actually publish results. But right now, that's not something FDA can require.
Let's take one more question if there is, and then we'll adjourn.
Can you just clarify physiologically what Plan B does? Does it prevent ovulation, or does it do something else?
Yes. It is a progestin-only contraceptive, and it works primarily through prevention of ovulation. It can change the conditions in the uterus and in the fallopian tube such that fertilization may be less likely to occur if ovulation has occurred. Hypothetically, although there's very little data directly on this because of the limitations of research on human cells and human eggs and embryos, there's been very little study of human fertilization and human development and implantation. But in theory, it can change the uterine lining such that if ovulation does occur and if fertilization does occur, then it might reduce the chance that implantation would occur of a fertilized egg. You have to remember, this is the same family of mechanisms that all birth control pills have. And the progestin-only birth control pills that are taken for long term do in fact change the uterine lining, which is why this is hypothetical. But it's not at all clear that a one-time dose of progestin would be able to act quickly enough to make those changes to be involved in reducing the chance of implantation. It's also important to remember that about half of fertilized eggs don't stay in the plant anyway. They will pass through the reproductive tract and not create a pregnancy. So when I talk about the range of mechanisms that are available to birth control pills and the IUD, many birth control pills, most of them work primarily through suppression of ovulation. Again, some of them work through these methods of reducing the chance of fertilization and hypothetically reducing the chance of implantation. And IUDs definitely work through changing the conditions in the uterus to reduce the chance of implantation. This is very different from RU46, which interrupts an established pregnancy after implantation. In fact, if a woman happens to already be pregnant and implantation has occurred, and this will happen because of something that happened a few weeks ago, not from last night. This will not have occurred. It's a physiological process of implantation. Fertilization implantation takes days and up to a week or more after unprotected sex. So if a woman happens to be pregnant from something that happened a few weeks ago, then taking Plan B emergency contraception will have no impact on that pregnancy. It will not harm the embryo or fetus. In fact, some forms of progestin are given to pregnant women to help them hang on to a pregnancy if they're prone to miscarriage. It will just not have any effect. It won't terminate a pregnancy. It will have no effect on the pregnancy. She will remain pregnant. So this is truly a contraceptive method like all other contraceptive methods. And it is not causing abortion with the commonly accepted view that abortion is terminating an established pregnancy through either surgery or through IVF.
Okay, I'd like to give Dr. Wood another round of applause. Director